Now, when we talk about creating a gender-inclusive agricultural sector, because ultimately that's where we want to go. That's what we want to achieve through the AFCFTA. Well, we're going to be talking about the need to design a new generation of agricultural policies and complementary measures that reset, that spur inclusive agricultural development in the context of the AFCFTA. And again, to be able to do that, we're going to have to confront and we're going to have to challenge our policymakers, and as policymakers ourselves, we're going to have to challenge our understanding of what these inequalities are. And of course, I would like to mention particularly the before we get to expanding on what the opportunities are, I want to talk particularly about the horticultural exports, because it's important to understand that women represent the vast majority of the workforce in this fast growing sector. But again, the working conditions in these chains were found to be poor. And these studies are important because they force us to really examine what we may not necessarily know. So, for example, if you look at horticultural exports, there are a number of health risks involved in the horticulture production. And while employment there is temporary or seasonal for the majority of women workers. So I think it's important to understand. So yes, the sector does provide employment and new employment for women, but this very often is casual employment in the food and in the transport sectors. And these jobs, as an ECA publication, human rights publication points out, is unlikely to have pension, it's unlikely to have any material leave or sickness benefits. And so in that way, yes, it does provide opportunities, but it's not particularly quality opportunities. And in Rwanda, there was a study undertaken by UNCTAD, which found that the floriculture and greenfield sectors, which are non-traditional cash crops, and again, were seen to offer significant employment opportunities for low-income workers in peri-urban and rural areas. But again, questions arose with respect to the quality of the work generated and the associated socio-economic costs, because it's important to note that female workers in floriculture tend to be significantly exposed to pesticides and other hazardous conditions. So again, when we're talking about agricultural jobs in the era of the AFCFTA, because we want the AFCFTA to distinguish itself from other initiatives, from other regional integration initiatives, to build, to expand, to scale, to do better. But we're talking about the kind of jobs, the quality employment, access to decent jobs, productive employment that can be created in the era of the AFCFTA. And it's important as part of our deliberations for us to go back to the context, to how the world has changed from what was the onset of COVID-19, I think, for the continent, and in South Africa, certainly. We stopped, South Africa literally stopped for COVID-19 in March, but we see from the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, from AGRA, that points out that the effects of COVID-19 are aggravating these vulnerabilities, particularly for women in the agricultural sector. And we've seen that the productivity gap between men and women farmers under normal circumstances is high because of this unequal access to assets, to inputs, to services. But this pandemic, this crisis, threatens to exacerbate, to increase, to entrench existing inequalities. Now, such differences could increase the potential impact on food production, food security, and nutrition. And in addition to a brief by the African Economic Research Consortium, there are a number of other studies that draw attention to the potential impact of the COVID crisis to creating a severe food security crisis in Africa. And I would encourage you at this point to consult the readings, and particularly starting with the reading by the African Economic Research Consortium. Right. So when we talk about, I'm sorry, let me go back to my slide. When we talk about creating new opportunities to reset, to spur, to rebuild agricultural development in the context of the AFCFTA, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about at a very high level, but again, you are going to be unpacking this in more detail, but a very high level, something to just trigger the thought process. We're talking about seeking opportunities for women's participation in the production of high-value agricultural commodities and agri-food products for export markets within the continent. But again, remember the terms of involvement for women, because we don't want trade opportunities in the era of this AFCFTA to perpetuate, to entrench gender inequalities. We want to build back better. We want this to be business unusual. We're also talking about prioritizing additional opportunities for women small-scale producers and exporters to competitively participate in high-value agricultural regional value chains, talking about developing overarching sector-specific capacity, focusing on enabling and fostering country sectoral initiatives that create and strengthen regional value chains. What sectors have the potential for boosting value? And the readings have identified tea and textiles. But what other sectors can you identify with the high potential for boosting value in your country? Again, what are the niche export markets with the potential for further development? So we're really talking about participants, about identifying empowerment opportunities for example, that could include women's participation in the production of high-value agricultural commodities, agri-food products for export markets within the continent. That could also include high-return crops and crops with forward linkages and value-added sectors. But as I said, this is but a start. And when you're considering a national strategy for your country, and when you examining the opportunities and the risks and the challenges in the agricultural sector, and specifically when you're thinking about policy reforms and complementary measures to spur inclusive agricultural development in the context of the FCFTA, you may use the opportunities that I have presented as a start, but it is but a start. And I look forward to engaging with you and to listening to how you would be building on these opportunities that I have outlined. So we move now to the manufacturing sector. And very quickly, when we talk about opportunities, we see that women represent about 38% of the manufacturing workforce on the continent. And the highest representation is in the textile and clothing sector. We also see that labor intensive, and why? And this is because the textile and clothing sector is particularly labor intensive, and it offers significant potential to bring about change to some of the most marginalized and disadvantaged and vulnerable groups of women across the continent. Now, in the apparel sector, we note that approximately 80% of the workers are employed, particularly if we look at Ethiopia's apparel sector. Approximately 80% of the workers there are women. And in addition to Ethiopia, the garment sector is growing in South Africa, in Mauritius, in Madagascar, and across North African countries. Now, as entrepreneurs, women own large and medium-scale manufacturing businesses, as well as small to medium micro enterprises in the informal sector that are more artisanal. And women, yes, but when formal sector, female-owned firms are active in manufacturing, they tend to produce garments or textiles or food. So participants, you can read through the opportunities, but I'd like to go through now and to touch very briefly on and you'd see the opportunities continues on slide 2 on the expectations of the AFCFTA, particularly as it seeks to create intra-African exports of industrial products by 25 to 30% or 36 to $43 billion. So strong opportunities. you see why employment of women in sectors with high exports under the AFCFTA, what that could bring, and how intracontinental exports through the development of export-oriented manufacturing industries could create new jobs, particularly for women workers and entrepreneurs. And of course, the fact that integrating female workers into new and expanding industries, which are likely to emerge as significant growth drivers, also presents significant opportunities in the AFCFTA. But they inherent in opportunities are also risks. So we look at the first risk and the fact that female workers are often disproportionately represented in lower skilled intensive levels of value chains and in lower skilled intensive sectors and jobs is a risk for women in manufacturing. And if we look at the evidence and the findings of export processing zones, we see that there's mixed evidence on whether women earn better wages and benefits. So while export processing zones in some African countries have brought women new opportunities in manufacturing, they've also kept the majority confined to lower paid and unskilled jobs. There are also gender inequalities that may be reinforced when industrial expansion is based on increasing jobs for women while maintaining gender-based sectoral segregation and large gender wage gaps. There is also the potential for inequalities for technologies that excludes disadvantaged women, and of course gender stereotypes and about women's natural abilities that have been used to devalue the skills of women. So while there may be these opportunities in the AFCFTA, the fact that cultural norms and gender stereotypes designate particular roles, traditional roles for women who may be seen more as caretakers, as great sewers, as seamstresses, that also confines and keeps women to low-skilled positions in the manufacturing sector. And of course, there's the challenge of automation and artificial intelligence that leaves the future uncertain for women who will have particularly low skilled. It leaves that future uncertain for women in the manufacturing sector. Now, globally, the manufacturing sector has been hardest hit by COVID-19 and the ensuing containment measures. And that really has seen some of the gains that have been made, including in African countries, for closing the gender wage gap and increasing women's labor participation in manufacturing. We're seeing those gains being reversed as a result of the pandemic. Now, when we're talking about opportunities and how can we leverage these opportunities to create a gender-inclusive manufacturing sector, some of the opportunities could include revisions to the industrial policy strategies and responses of African countries, because colleagues, that provides a particular opportunity for policymakers and industries to support more equitable manufacturing strategies as part of inclusive industrialization in the era of the AFCFTA. And part of this process should include integrating female workers into expanding export-oriented industries that could emerge as growth drivers, identifying high growth sectors for women's economic empowerment, including value-added goods and regional value-added chain development. But again, ensuring that the creation of these employment opportunities is not accompanied by new patterns of inequalities. Now, the African Development Bank has pointed to textile and clothing industries, as particularly fashion design, as a significant opportunity, because 600% of value they estimate can be created through the cotton value chain. And again, the creative industries is also seen as a particular opportunity sector within the manufacturing industry, and the fact that this sector provides strong opportunities, not just economic benefits, but also creativity while promoting a sense of Africanness. So we have economic developments, but we have other strong advantages that are inherent in the creative industries. But I think it's also very quickly, I want to touch on the challenges, and particularly the environmental challenges posed in the garment and textile industry, because it's important for us to have a holistic approach when we are thinking of policy responses. So yes, the textile and garment sector does promote significant opportunities, but it also has environmental challenges. And your readings that are provided, that will be provided to you, expands on that. So when we're talking about textile and the garment sector, we also have to, as a significant opportunity, we also have to think about what about green manufacturing? What are the opportunities for green manufacturing? Because the textile and garment sector does pose environmental challenges, as it requires a lot of water. It involves the use of chemicals at various stages of the value chain, from cotton farming, production of fibers and yarn. And so we also need to be thinking, as part of our policy responses, what could green manufacturing entail? But again, what would be the technological implications of that type of manufacturing, and what would be the implications of women's limited access to those technologies and technical skills to be able to leverage or benefit or contribute to green manufacturing? And then again, of course, we're talking about the implications of the fourth industrial revolution for women, because those working in low skill and routine manufacturing jobs are expected to bear the brunt of this technological upheaval. So again, it's critically important that we talk about policies that raise the education and skills level. Policymakers have the opportunity to remove underlying constraints that limit women's participation to technical subjects, or low participation to technical subjects. And industries have the opportunities to support upskilling a workforce. So specialized training can widen the choice for female workers in a broader range of industrial sectors and occupations. But of course, this will need to be considered alongside other targeted skill developments and interventions that ensure and enable that women are able to access higher skill jobs and higher value addition. Now, when we look at the services sector, we see that while agricultural might be the largest employer, the services sector is absolutely, women are increasing their shares in services employment as they transition from other sectors to services at a faster rate than men. Now, this is the situation for many developing countries, that also includes many African countries. And the ILO has a report on this that I would encourage you to read. Now, it's very important to understand that services account for a large activity of women employment in MSMEs. And as a key driver of job creation, the services sector has this potential. It has the strong potential to contribute to gender equality outcomes and in African economies, and accelerate inclusive economic growth. Now, I'm not going to go through the numbers. You're going to look at that more closely, but you can see, arising from the World Bank study, that tells us the implementation of the AFCFTA will create better jobs for women workers. As a result of output expansion in key female-intensive sectors across the continent, there will be a vast increase. So I will leave that for you to look at and for you to better understand. But I want to touch very quickly now on the constraints, because if we're talking about an inclusive services sector, we need to understand what these gender-specific constraints are to be able to ensure adequate policy responses. And while the liberalization of services trade, because that's what we're talking about now in the context of the AFCFTA, while the liberalization of services trade has the potential to generate further employment and income opportunities for women, it does not automatically lead to improved outcomes for women. And I would encourage you then to also, at this point, to look at the studies. There's been an UNCTAD study on COMESA that talks about tourism and ICT opportunities, but also found that while the fact that tourism has increased employment opportunities for women, there were specific gender-related concerns that were raised on the impact and the fact that female tourism workers in the region were often confined and concentrated to lower skilled jobs. Now, again, there's no clear evidence that tells us that financial sector liberalization has had a positive effect on small scale borrowers and savers, including for women. So it's important for us to understand that and to know going forward that there will need to be particular support structures to be put in place to ensure that when trade in services is liberalized, that these small scale entrepreneurs are able to access the benefits of that. And of course, there will be magnitude of short-term adjustment costs and the availability of ways and means to deal with them. And I will encourage you to look at that more closely and see what that entails. Now, as AU members embark on negotiations to open up trade in services, emphasis needs to be placed on enhancing skills and employability for both women and men. But we have seen from the literature, we have seen from research findings that women's employment is primarily concentrated in lower value and lower paid services sectors. So advancing productive employment and decent jobs for women in services trade towards a more inclusive and equitable growth path should then be prioritized as part of the trade and services negotiations, because the fact is that women's employment is primarily concentrated in lower value and lower paid services sectors. So there needs to be a stronger emphasis as part of a move towards inclusive and an equitable growth path to what could be these empowerment opportunities that could be created for women in services trade. But again, ensuring that women are able to take advantage of higher skilled services jobs in the 5 priority sectors requires the formulation of gender-sensitive regulatory and policy frameworks supported by complementary measures. Now, we know that our negotiators are going into trade in services negotiations, and the 5 services sectors that will be negotiated are business, communications, financial, tourism, and transport. We've covered that in module 1, but there are additional readings for you to be able to expand on your understanding in this area. And I want to make this very practical. I want to make this section very practical because it's critically important that consultations are held with those affected by liberalizing trade in services, including with vulnerable groups, with industry, with government ministries of finance, trade, gender, education, to identify what should be the most appropriate liberalization policies to meet national development priorities and objectives. So as we go, as our countries and as our negotiators go into the liberalization, trade in services liberalization negotiations, these kind of consultations will be convened. And the South Center has advanced a case approach to gender and WTO service negotiations, which involves consultation, assessment, specific commitments, and evaluation. And I would encourage you to look at that more closely because I think it is useful. It does provide you with a framework, certainly to start with, towards a better understanding of how these consultations could unfold. We move now to the section on AFCFTA implementation, implications for women entrepreneurs, small-scale and informal cross-border traders. Now, I have covered women in trade in the first section, but I'd like you to look at this more closely because it also elaborates on women as entrepreneurs, the fact that women make up 58% of the continent's self-employed population, and the fact that women-led businesses account for approximately 40% of Africa's SMEs. But again, the majority of these women-owned enterprises are micro or small, involving small-scale trade. So the importance of ensuring that the AFCFTA leaves no one behind, and it doesn't just benefit the big players that we spoke about at the beginning, is critically important in understanding the contribution that MSMEs make and how these MSMEs and the constraints that they confront and what is required for them to be able to leverage the benefits of the AFCFTA, the partnerships that can be accessed and that can be created with the bigger players, with the private sector. It's critically important to understanding what those could be. But as a start, we need to first know the constraints that these various enterprises confront. Now, when we look at AFCFTA advantages, we also see that there are advantages in terms of the creation of regional value chains, because larger export-oriented industries can source supplies from smaller women-owned businesses across borders. There's the fact that when opening up borders to trade will ease cross-trade of raw materials and semi-finished products. It provides access to technological innovation, new skills, and alternative sources of capital. But we also see that the constraints that women-led SMEs confront will make it almost impossible to some extent to compete and to benefit from AFCFTA implementation. So first we see that there's the challenges of SMEs confronting when they and competing with imported goods when trade is liberalized. Women-owned enterprises are less likely to have acquired the necessary technical and legal expertise and the ability to market their products effectively. They lack the necessary access and to information and to networks and to finance for assets and training and skills. They are often crowded in local trading activities that don't offer much potential for expansion and growth. And this is some of the research, and these are the findings. And UNCTAD has done a few studies in this area, and they point to the fact that women SMEs have not been able to benefit from an expanded market because of the various constraints that they confront. And again, the fourth industrial revolution is going to provide opportunities in terms of fast-growing mobile phone penetration networks. But we need to be able, and in terms of e-commerce, that speaks to opportunities for women entrepreneurs and traders and decent job creation. And it also, these digital technologies promise to help women to access trade. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not women will be able to access this because of the persistent gender gap in digital access, which keeps women and work opportunities away from millions of women. So the fact that there is all these opportunities that where women can balance their business and domestic obligations, the fact that they can have access to an international customer base, the flexibility that these online digital platforms offer. The fact of the matter is that women face this gender gap in digital access, in digital literacy, which will limit their ability to be able to access these expanded opportunities provided by e-commerce and online platforms. So closing the gender gap in digital inclusion must be an urgent priority. particularly in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, bridging this digital gender divide by addressing poor digital literacy and a lack of digital skills must be part of accompanying policy considerations when we are talking about the forthcoming protocol on e-commerce and digital trade.